So the overview of today's talk is just to talk about 4 areas: why we need clinical trials, what are the major trials that have been completed, what are the big trials that are coming up or in progress, and what's on the horizon, and how can we make things more efficient in the future. So we'll talk about what clinical trials are, and most of you in the audience will be very familiar with clinical trials, but essentially it's clinical research in which people volunteer to test out new treatments, interventions, and it's essentially a means to advance progress in various medical conditions. It could be a new drug treatment, it could be a non-drug treatment that's beneficial in slowing down progression. It could be a new way of making a diagnosis. It could be a biomarker that we can follow more efficiently follow someone's progression. So things like serum creatinine, which are used to measure progression of kidney disease. Are there better ways to measure that? Blood pressure treatment, things like tolvaptan that we'll talk about briefly, that have all been tested in clinical trials. And these are some examples of interventions that we've discussed: drugs, biological products, medical devices, surgical treatments. It could also be about health service delivery. How do we more effectively see people with PKD in clinics, or how can we make things more efficient? What can we do to prevent PKD? Is there a better way to deliver education? So it's actually clinical research embodies really quite a broad area of investigations. And we need clinical trials, as I mentioned, really essential for the development of new treatments. Firstly, to establish, do they work? Are they effective? And secondly, also to ensure that they're safe. And I've got here a little diagram of erythropoietin stimulating agents that are used to treat anemia in chronic kidney disease and in people who are on dialysis. And when they first came out in the 1990s, they were revolutionary because it meant that people on dialysis who get anemic don't need blood transfusions. And so by having a fortnightly or a monthly injection of these agents, they're recombinant proteins, it really revolutionized the treatment of people who are on dialysis. And we thought in the 1990s that if your hemoglobin or your blood count with these agents was returned to normal, then that was a good thing. But in the early 2000s, we discovered that a too high hemoglobin with these agents actually causes harm. And that was a real surprise to everyone. And that's where clinical trials uncovered that safety problem, and then led to redefining how we should use these medications. So safety is a really, really important thing in terms of clinical trials, is establishing that treatments are effective. And following on for these clinical trials leads to change in clinical practice. And when clinical practice is really determined by clinical practice guidelines that are developed by national bodies, both here in Australia, but as well as internationally. I'll draw briefly on those later, but clinical practice guidelines guide our best of care treatment, and they're dependent on clinical trials. So the clinical practice guideline groups meet together and they review the evidence that's available for various treatments, and they look at the quality of the evidence, and clinical trials and clinical research is essential for them to have that body of evidence to make those guidelines. A second important role for clinical trials is that our drug regulatory agency, the TGA and the FDA, they look at clinical trial evidence to decide whether a drug is safe to use, and also whether it can be listed on the pharmaceutical benefit scheme and have Medicare subsidy. So they look at the body of the evidence, just like clinical practice guideline groups. And so you can see here that how crucial clinical trials are for the whole process to really get things going and improve treatments. And as I said, by participating in clinical trials, it really does improve the standard of healthcare. We have a different, there's a more rigid, more stringent review of things, and it does indirectly raise standards of treatment as well, and it's also beneficial for people who are involved in clinical trials. There's a lot of different type of clinical trials. They can range from small studies where people are interviewed and there's data collection. And those sort of studies have become increasingly important to understand the particular problems that people face. So qualitative studies, interviews, they're very, very important in terms of understanding that perspective. Then there's large population studies, which can range anywhere between a few hundred patients to thousands, and I'll show you an example of that. And those studies where we understand the whole population of people with PKD in a group, in a country or in internationally, help us understand what the demographics looks like, what's the average age, what do they experience, are they working full time, what's their rate of disease progression, what treatments are they on. So they're really crucial. And studies like registry studies fall into that category. And then our sort of the gold standard that guides whether a treatment is effective or not are the randomized controlled trials. And these are trials where one group gets a standard of care treatment that we know works, and it's compared to a new treatment that we aren't sure whether it's going to work or not. So they're the trials that guide us on getting PBS approval and TGA approval. So really crucial in sort of the whole process of improving treatments. These randomized controlled trials can range anywhere from days to weeks and up to 3 years. And we'll talk a little bit about that just to sort of illustrate the complexities behind that. So this diagram just shows just a quick example of a randomized controlled trial, just with generic labeling. So we might have a population of people with PKD who meet a specific criteria. So they may be certain age group, certain range of kidney function, and then they're randomized by a computer to fall into one of two groups. And so one group will get the standard of care treatment, what we know is the standard of care, and then the other group will get an additional treatment that we hypothesize will slow down disease progression. And it's really important to have these two groups, because when you're first evaluating a new drug or new medication or a new non-drug intervention, we have no idea whether it really is beneficial or not. And so if someone is going to commit to a treatment, then we want to be sure that that treatment works, and the randomized control design is the best way to evaluate that and to come with conclusive evidence. We know that people vary in their responses, but this tells us that in general, a population of people will respond to treatment, a new treatment, compared to standard of care. I just wanted to briefly talk about standard of care. So standard of care just means what's established in 2023. So what is the current best treatment, and then the new treatment is added on to that. And also the second thing to mention is that often these trials are blinded, which means that, for example, the control group will get a tablet, but it may not be an active drug. And the intervention group will get a tablet which contains the active intervention, but we won't be able to tell which one a person is until the trial's been completed. There are different trials, phases of trials. So there's basically 4 phases. So a phase 1 trial is when a drug is being first tested out in a group of people. So that can range anywhere between 20 or 30 people. And in that trial, it's usually a short-term study, a couple of weeks, and it's really to look at the safety of the intervention. The phase 2 trial is a larger study, so it may have 100 or so patients, and that's to get that first evidence that we're confident that new treatment is has got some evidence that it's going to work. And then the phase 3 trial is a much larger study, which can be anywhere between 1,000 to, in some cases, up to 30,000. Some trials like that involve hypertension and cholesterol, for much of these common diseases, they are now coming out with extremely large trials of that size. But the largest trials that have been done in polycystic kidney disease are about 1,000 or so in a randomized controlled trial. So the phase 3 trial becomes that trial which gives us the evidence that this drug, something or the intervention works, and we can change clinical practice guidelines. TGA will approve a medication. The phase 3 trials tend to go on for anywhere between 12 months up to 18 months, up to 3 years. They usually don't go beyond that, but you can get sufficient information about an intervention in that period of time about whether it's going to have an effect on kidney function decline, whether it changes kidney volume. Phase 4 trials are really larger trials that are also done after a trial has been approved. So, after a drug or a particular treatment has been approved. So it's just to gather additional safety evidence or information about an intervention in a trial. So just a few quick points about clinical trials. They can be Australian or New Zealand initiated, so they happen here in Australia, and they sometimes can go overseas, or they can come from overseas and they can involve Australia, like multi-center, we call them multi-center randomized control trials. They can be government funded, say by NHMRC or MRFF, or if pharmaceutical industry is developing a medication, they're industry funded. And the industry funded trials have dominated a lot of the large PKD trials in the last decade. It's also worth mentioning that, as I was saying earlier, that when a trial comes up, the investigators, for various reasons, may select a group of people within PKD to be involved. And the reason for that is that we want to best understand how the drug will work in the best possible situation. So someone who's got declining kidney function, where a drug will have the greatest effect and a greatest result. In some cases that population that will be chosen for trials. But at later times, once the initial evidence is gained, other groups within who've got PKD will benefit as well. So sometimes you might find that your ability to enter trials can be a bit restrictive if you don't fit into a certain range of kidney function, or it might be age group, but it's not that I wouldn't be disappointed by that. I think it's important that the trial is underway and that you'll have secondary benefits from that at a later date, even if you don't participate. Trials can happen mostly in Australia at the big teaching hospitals. They do also happen in some specialist rooms as well. And often the staff in trials, there's, in the case of PKD, will be someone, usually a clinician, nephrologist, and a group of nephrologists at a hospital. So there's often a principal investigators, and then there's associate investigators. And then there's also a clinical nurse coordinator as well, who will contact you for making appointments to try and work out whether you're eligible for the trial. So they're often the main staff that are involved. And of course, a trial, in being involved in a trial, is a big commitment in terms of time required. So some of the trials that do go on for a couple of years can involve multiple visits to the hospital. A lot of these days now, trials are becoming more focused on ensuring that the people who are enrolled in the trial, that we try and do our best to accommodate their needs. So, for example, some of the more recent trials match the visits to for the trial with your nephrologist or your treating nephrologist. They try and coordinate the blood tests at the same time so that you don't need to do additional blood tests, especially for the trial, or vice versa, that the trial blood results will be useful for your nephrologist. So there are some efficiencies. It's not perfect yet, but it's a work in progress, and hopefully the trials for the future will be a lot more streamlined and take into account people's time and flexibility, because sometimes coming to hospitals and getting parking isn't easy. So I'll move on to just talk about what big clinical trials have been completed. I just thought I'd take you through just a slight historical lesson, or just to give you a bit of background. And one of the big studies that was done from Australia by David Ravine at the Royal Melbourne was a population study in people who've got polycystic kidney disease, so that second category of study. And basically David developed the diagnostic criteria for ultrasound in polycystic kidney disease, and that involved about 200 people back in the early 1990s. And this criteria is being used today. It's basically the criteria in which children of people affected by PKD, people who are at risk of getting PKD, are diagnosed with polycystic kidney disease. So Australia had a very key role in developing that. So that was really, really important, beneficial research. This is a very complicated table, but I just wanted to show you another example of a population study that was done about a decade ago, but it was published in just this year, actually, 2023. And it was a large study of about 3,500 people with PKD all over the world. And I'm showing this to you because Australia was one of the contributors, and so people with PKD were involved in the study. And essentially it was what I was saying before, is it's a population study. It gave us a lot of information about how many people, what stages of kidney function they were in, how quickly they progressed. The writing's a little bit small, but it did show us information on that, for example, 60% of people working full-time, 70% of people were employed, 60% were full-time. So it gives us a lot of really important, useful information about planning for the future. So those sort of studies, and they also collected a lot of information about kidney function, and as I was saying, all the important things that we need to know that will help inform us designing future studies and being able to address the problems. And of course, most of you in the audience will be familiar with the tolvaptan trials. So these were extremely large randomized controlled trials involving about 1,000 patients each. They occurred in, I think, close to 40 countries, and essentially a randomized controlled trial testing whether tolvaptan was beneficial or not. And it was a very long, drawn-out process. You can see here that the first trial was published in 2012, and the FDA reviewed this trial and wanted more evidence. One of the things they wanted was more evidence on people who dropped out of the study because of side effects. Also, the thing that they measured at the end, which was change in kidney volume, wasn't at that time an accepted measurement, and so the FDA wanted more information on whether tolvaptan affected kidney function decline, and this was demonstrated in both studies. So that's why there was a second study done for that reason. So the first study was 3 years long, looking at total kidney volume, or the effect of tolvaptan on kidney function, kidney volume size. And the second study was looking at what tolvaptan did to the kidney function. And in both studies, they showed that tolvaptan slowed down kidney disease progression, so slowed down the rate of decline of the serum creatinine. The second study was 1 year in duration, but these trials are very, very complex and they take a long time. And I'll explain a little bit later on about the things that we've learnt from doing studies like this to make things more efficient. I guess Australia was a participant in these trials as well, so that's another reason for showing it. And of course, the study that was led from here at Westmead, which was a multi-centre trial looking at the effect of increased water intake, was another Australian study that was undertaken. And this was again a 3-year study, looked at kidney function decline and also looked at the effect of water intake on change in kidney volume or kidney enlargement. And the hypothesis, or what we thought or predicted, was that increasing water intake would slow down disease progression. And what we found was that people with PKD had already been told a lot about water intake, and pleasingly, most people in the study were drinking around about 2 litres of water a day. And that's actually quite a significant amount to be drinking, because the general average Australian population drinks about 1 litre. So what our study showed is that drinking more than 2 litres a day didn't seem to be at any extra benefit. So the study did not disprove that drinking water wasn't important. I think certainly the evidence up until this point was that maintaining adequate hydration is very important, but drinking beyond 2 or 3 litres is not effective. And one reason for that could be that it is hard to maintain that volume of water in a sustained period of time. And it may have disappointed some people, but I think it is an important result to have obtained, because it has helped us inform clinical practice guidelines, and it helps us, the community as in general, move forward, because we're always stuck with trying to think, well, is water intake, how important is it? How much should we be drinking? So I think the importance of the clinical trial is to help us move forward and to reach a conclusion and just move on to the next step. So the KD...
Gopi, can I just interrupt you there and just clarify? Vanessa, were you involved in that trial?
Yes, I was.
Yeah. Do you want to give your perspective? Is that appropriate, Gopi, while we're just on that?
Thanks for that. That'd be great.
Sure. So I was part of that trial. I was in the control group. So essentially for me, I just had to go about normal everyday life, drinking the normal amount that I was used to. And I didn't find that being a 3-year study was a particular burden on me, and perhaps that's because, I was just able to go about ordinary life. But I only needed to go to Westmead Hospital. I think it was yearly or 6 months, but it wasn't onerous at all. And I'm not too far away from the hospital, so at least that was pretty easy for me to do. I think if you had to travel great distances, perhaps that would be more difficult. But I think the team tried to distribute themselves as much as possible to allow people to be part of the trial. And so from my experience, I think, this is probably the least amount of burden that you can ever have in a trial, when you just go about your everyday life. And I would have had the sorts of tests that were done at that similar sort of frequency anyway for my nephrologist. So it goes to show that not every trial requires you to really go above and beyond, what you would normally do. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
I think that's one of the things about a study that's run more from a government perspective. Sometimes the pharmaceutical trials can be very restrictive in visits and things, and so they provide windows, but they are becoming more flexible. So this informs some guidelines. Thanks for that perspective, Vanessa. So major trials in progress, I'll just quickly go through this. The big trial that in Australia that's underway at the moment is IMPEDE PKD, which is a a multi-center blinded randomized control trial, and it's testing whether metformin or placebo is effective on kidney function decline. And this is a trial that's again funded by government, MRFF funding, and it's got some specific criteria. So as I was mentioning, aged between 18 to 70 years old, confirmed diagnosis of PKD, and eGFR of 45 to 89. And that I guess that provides the eligibility, and it's currently underway at centres in New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, and Western Australia as well, and there's probably some other sites opening as well. And that trial will be close to 1,000 people involved in that trial. So they're currently recruiting, and if you're interested in being involved, just contact your nephrologist who'll know more about it or where to refer you to. There is another smaller study that's finished. Vanessa, you, I guess, which involves beetroot juice, and it was to look at the effect of beetroot juice in lowering blood pressure. And with this study has been completed, it was led by my colleague, Dr. Priyanka Sagar, who's at Westmead Hospital, and it will we'll have the results in the next couple of months. So it's all been analysed, and that's sometimes the it takes a long time to do these trials. Even a trial that's about 5 weeks in duration, there's a lot of data to collect at the end and to do the analysis, so it takes a bit of time.
I might just chime in on that one if that's okay, Gopi, because I was also in that trial as well. So this one, I was needing to take the beetroot juice every day, so actively part of the trial. We were supplied with everything, so that was great. Didn't have to worry about sort of procuring blood pressure measuring machine, or procuring the beetroot juice or anything like that. Again, I didn't find it overly onerous. It was pretty simple. It was just a quick beetroot shot. Just take that as part of your daily intake of food and drink anyway. And we did need to take blood pressure recordings, but it was short. Like, it was a very short trial, and I think I only needed to go to the hospital once or twice for the actual testing. Had no negative effects or anything like that. So again, I really felt that this was a really accessible trial to be part of. Just really didn't ask too much. And one of the things I have to say with both the trials that I've been a part of is I do find that the teams are very considerate. They do seem to really appreciate that we're putting in our time and that we're choosing to be a part of this. So I found it rewarding from an interpersonal point of view, because everyone's really caring. They really want to put you first, and they really appreciate your involvement. So that's really lovely. It's good to feel valued as well.
Yeah, thanks for that, Vanessa. Yeah, that's really the case with all the trials, because we really understand the the commitment and the dedication. You're going really out of your way to be involved in these studies. Time is ticking by, so I'll quickly go on. And what's on the horizon? So this part will be fairly brief, or I'll keep it brief. This is just I wanted to just put this diagram up. It's a diagram of a hypothetical PKD kidney cell, and it's just to summarize all the things that are currently being looked at, reviewed. We know a lot about how cysts can form, some of the proteins inside cells that are not working properly. There's various medications and drugs that are being looked at to look at this. Some of them have already been looked at, so but there are others sort of in development at the moment. And just to give you some very quick examples of some really interesting studies that are on the horizon. This is a study that's been completed just in September this year. It's by a biotech company in the US, Regulus Therapeutics, who've got a compound called RGLS8429. And essentially it's a it's a DNA peptide, and it alters the way PKD1, PKD2 genes are being expressed. And this is probably one of the first steps into a type of, not quite gene therapy, but a type of indirect gene therapy. So it's using a molecule that upregulates the gene that's not working so well in ADPKD. And so their preliminary results were, it's a phase 1 study, so it's just got less than 30 people involved, so 12 people. They received this drug every second week. And in this case, they were looking at safety. There were no safety issues. And they were also looking at some simple markers of that's going to be effective. So what they found was that the active drug, people who got that, had an increase in the protein that the PKD1 gene encodes, polycystine 1, as well as polycystine 2. And the study went on for 3 months. So this was very promising that some of the PKD genes are being increased by this treatment, and they'll lead on to a phase 2 study and then hopefully a phase 3 study down the track. This is another, just something on the horizon again, and it's just to sort of give you an example of what people are thinking about. This particular slide is just an image from experimental animals, and that they've worked out how to target a drug to particular sites in the kidney, because some of the drugs that haven't worked in the past in PKD has been because the doses weren't high enough to reach the kidney. And so by getting ways to target the kidney, they'll make it easier for drugs to work better. And I also want to just mention Professor Ian Smythe, who's from Monash, who's recently established a new biotech company, some evidence, some new medications that have got some success, that have got success in animal models, and that's currently in development, and hopefully we'll hear more about that as time progresses, but that's a very exciting development. And then lastly, maybe we could talk more about this in question time. There's a lot of interest in the keto diet intervention, and really of great interest. I think just to keep my comments very brief, the evidence is still being gathered. We essentially need a large randomized controlled trial to tell us whether it's effective or not. There is some emerging evidence that it might be, but there's still more information to be gathered. So how can we make trials quicker and better? This was just some data that we collected at the end of the PREVENT ADPKD trial, the one on water intake that I showed you before, and just to see what people thought about what was easy and what wasn't. And as you can imagine, questionnaires were easy, blood tests were easy, study visits mostly were easy. The worst things that people found difficult were doing the MRI scans and 24-hour urine collections, which are probably the least favored test. And so some of the solutions for this, for the future, are to think about how we can do trials designed better. So one example is a recent trial called Stage PKD, which used to basically combined, put together 2 trials in one, so that we were able to reduce the duration of the whole process from 2 3-year trials to a single 1.5-year trial. And part of that was because we, this was a study that was run by a pharmaceutical company, but there was a lot more learnings from what was achieved with the tolvaptan trials. And so just the way that the statistics were analysed and the biomarkers that were used. And secondly, can we eliminate the need for things like MRI scans, things like more specific biomarkers, and that's going to really help us for the future. I want to lastly just finish off on artificial intelligence and what's impact it might have in PKD. And I'll just keep this very brief because it's really at an early stage, but there's 2 big areas where artificial intelligence is currently being developed. One is in the the diagnosis part of PKD and monitoring disease progression. And so how can we automate the analysis of kidney MRIs? And that's certainly, that technology is available. A more probably clinically important one is analyzing the gene and making that reporting and that analysis quicker. Currently, when someone has a genetic test, it can take anywhere between 6 weeks to 3 months to get results. And so AI might be able to automate that and enable a faster delivery of results, which will be good. And also other prediction tools. How can we predict whether someone's going to get kidney failure and someone's not going to? And that's where these large population studies using huge amounts of data will be really beneficial. And perhaps as time goes on, we'll be able to do just that, we'll be able to personalize treatment and predict who will get problems with certain treatments. So I might just finish off here because I think I've been going for longer than I expected, and just talk about questions for Vanessa. So I'll leave it to you.
Thanks,
Amy,
Gopi.
did you want to
That
jump into
was
the question?
great. Yes, happy to do that, and really happy for you, Vanessa, to add in anything along the way that might have come up as Gopi was talking there. The first sort of question or statement comes from Nicole, who has PKD and is currently on dialysis, and she's interested in research that will benefit her children. I'm sure that Nicole's point there is that, you know, there's generations coming, but it just sort of did make me think that are there any situations where children or late teens are able to be involved in anything?
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, that's actually a bit of an oversight on me. There are a lot more clinical research going on in the pediatric field, and in fact, things like tolvaptan are being evaluated in the pediatric population. And I've always told my colleagues in pediatrics that I think we'll be shifting the focus of treating PKD more to children, because I think we're going to slowly recognise that that's the place to intervene, not in adults. So we'll be seeing a lot more.
So the sooner the better, in essence there. Yeah. Okay, that's interesting.
Can I just chip in on that one too, just quickly? Another thing for people to bear in mind too is, for example, with myself, my EGFR is over 90, so I'm stage 1. And a lot of people think that trials are not for them unless they're further progressed than that. But actually, if you're thinking about your children and maybe they're stage 1 or stage 2, and at the moment, maybe they don't want anything to do with PKD, like they prefer just to ignore it. But then if they're going to wait for the outcomes of trials to be able to help them, but they're not going to participate in those trials, there's a bit of a problem there, because the trials struggle to recruit people. So you actually do need people who even are maybe stage 1, stage 2, or younger people to participate in the trials, to then be able to help themselves and their children as well, rather than waiting for those who are more progressed or older, or just assuming someone else will do it. So unfortunately, I would encourage that people do need to be really proactive and join trials where you can, or at least consider it, because just waiting for these solutions it's not going to work. Like, everyone needs to actually be involved.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I know that in preparation for this, we've discussed that as well, and it's very evident that sometimes people with PKD are inclined to not really go out and talk about it or make a big deal out of it, and they, you know, there's some, you know, complexities around that emotionally. But actually, even if you just quietly want to go and do something like this and participate in a trial, then, you know, it could be making a real difference. Thanks very much. So the next one comes from Christine, who's asked, are we closer to finding a way to stop the growth of cysts on kidneys? Probably touched on that a little bit Gopi, but you could probably be specific. And for people wanting to have a family, is genetic engineering possible? And I think, essentially, Christine's probably talking about IVF type intervention there.
Yeah, that's right. So just to go to the first one, stop growth. There's actually, like, I haven't presented it today, but there's a whole body of evidence now that we can slow down growth. So firstly, things like dietary, following a good diet, so restricting your sodium intake, maintaining a healthy body weight, those sort of dietary interventions are actually really important, and they've been shown now over the last decade to slow down cyst growth. Blood pressure control is another important bit of information. There was a large study of 800 people that was done called the HALT PKD study, which showed that. Tolvaptan, of course, slows down cyst growth, and they're sort of the existing treatments, but there's also drugs that we have that didn't quite work in clinical trials, and one of them that's really effective in the laboratory is sirolimus and everolimus. These are immunosuppressant drugs that are sometimes used in transplantation, but we also know that they slow down growth, and they worked effectively in the laboratory, but they failed in clinical trials mainly because people got other side effects from them. And that's where I guess things like drug targeting, using that drug, but being able to target it to the kidney will probably be something that can solve that problem. And then in terms of genetic engineering, that's also, we didn't discuss that, but a big area, and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is now established, well and truly established. So certainly a approach that can be taken in consultation with your nephrologist and being referred to a fertility centre that has expertise in that area.
Great, thank you. So the next question comes from Andrew, and Andrew is interested in the eligibility, which I guess we've touched on there, so we might have covered that, but feel free to clarify anything there. But eligibility for clinical trials, and also Andrew's interested in your perspective on Ketocitra.
Oh, yeah. So actually, Vanessa, did you want to talk about a little bit more about eligibility? Because you made the point how important it is to be involved in trials. I think my message would be, trials are sometimes specific to a certain population, but there can be many other trials that are broader. Like, for example, the big PKD study with the beetroot juice was quite broad inclusion criteria, and the PREVENT trial also was. Vanessa, did you have any other comments on that?
Yeah, sure. So the current metformin one, I'm not eligible because my eGFR is too high, but I was eligible for the water intake and for the beetroot one. So it does show like that there is a variety of different things that you can be involved in. I noticed that someone in the chat has also flagged that they're not hearing about the trials, so their nephrologists are not telling them. They don't know if they're eligible, etc. What I would suggest is really checking with PKD Australia, because PKD Australia is sort of promoting or publishing these trials where they're available, and that's to help the clinicians and the researchers with being able to recruit people to them. So maybe that could be your first point of call, whether you're keeping in touch through Facebook or through the website, etc. But just checking in every now and again and seeing what you might be eligible for, see what's on. That could be an option. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's so much more research going on at the moment than there was 10 years ago, and so I think they'll just keep keep to looking at those at PKD's through website, and there's there'll be more trials coming up. Vanessa, did you want to talk about Ketocitra?
I sure do.
I don't want to put you on the spot.
No, that's okay. So this is, I guess, a bit of a passion project for me because I've seen in the community, particularly in social media, that there's a lot of interest in Thomas Weems's work in the US in particular, around these plant-focused ketogenic diets and Keto Citra as sort of a supplement that you can take and so on. So the one thing I would say to the community is that this is very much on our radar. As Gopi said before, we are looking into it. So there are a lot of researchers who are having a look at, okay, what are the pros and cons of this and how can we run studies to find out more, etc. Australia is in contact with the US. So it's more a matter right now of, watch this space because information is coming. But I guess the important thing for us, just generally, I guess, as a community overall, is knowing that whatever is said about it is true and scientific and proven, and that we can rely upon the information. And also, I know people sometimes despair because they say, well, these studies take too long, and some people are trying these diets and trying these supplements now. Why can't we get onto this information more quickly? But what I would say to you is that now we have things called living guidelines, and those are amazing. So what's happening with living guidelines is that researchers are looking at all the different studies that are going on across the world. And this is one area of interest, nutrition in PKD. And they're looking at, okay, so what is happening in real time? And then updating those guidelines in real time. So that's what's actually happening at the moment, is these things are being considered for, I guess, commentary in guidelines or recommendations to be made to the population. So don't think that it's being ignored, because it's certainly not. So just, as I said, watch this space because information is coming. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you, Vanessa. And I think going back to, I guess, things that are proven and that are going to work. So that's where those clinical trials are important. And for Keto Citra, we need a large randomized controlled trial to show that it is beneficial, because as I was showing you the example with the the erythropoietin, the assumption might be that something's going to work, and we all want something to work, but sometimes that doesn't always turn out. You can be I've seen trials where it's just been totally unexpected results, where you found either something's been really beneficial and you didn't think it was going to be, or it has been no effect, or it's been the opposite and it's caused harm. So that would be the main thing with Keto Citra, is that there's only really a limited number of clinical studies that have been done, and they haven't shown us what they do to kidney disease progression, kidney volume, and we really need that information to know that it works.
Yeah, good. It's good. It's good to discuss that one, because it does come up for people a lot. And essentially, we're all desperately searching for a cure for ourselves or our loved ones or our patients or what have you. So, if those things were to make a difference, but certainly, the science behind it's important up front. Thanks. Janice is wondering, how do trials work when you live in a regional area, for example, Wollongong, or perhaps in Queensland's case, Toowoomba or something like that?
Yeah, so I can maybe briefly answer that. So in trials that we've run, any of them, if they're involving industry, so the tolvaptan trials or the government funded trials, there's always allocation for a budget to assist with travel, and also to provide support.
That's great.
Yeah. And so it's just really contacting your trial centre to discuss it, because we don't want you to be inconvenienced.
Yeah, that's good to know. Vanessa, any further comments from you on that one?
I'm in a metro area, so I can't comment on that. Thanks.
Okay.
We've got a rare disease called cystinosis that Westmead's involved with, and so there's only, there'd be only 30 or 40 children who have this condition, so they're, all their travel supported to come to Sydney to be involved.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting, which actually sort of leads me to the next question, which is one from Kevin. Is it known currently what number or percentage of Australians have PKD? Because I guess not only that's an interesting fact, perhaps, or estimate, but it's interesting to know then how funding for trials might be impacted by that number, or, as you say, location with the cystinosis issue. So, yeah, some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've got a lot of thoughts. It's an area of big frustration, I think, for kidney disease in general. It doesn't get the funding that it deserves. I think that's a big problem. And I guess if I'm out of desperation, I can only appeal to you as the audience to bring that up, because it's very hard to get funding, and kidney disease in particular doesn't seem to attract as much funding. But in terms of your question about population, the original studies were actually from Denmark, and they were really amazing studies that were done in the 1950s, which established that about one in every 1,000 people has polycystic kidney disease. And for many years, that was sort of slightly contentious, disputed a little bit. But in a few years ago, there was a study that was done on using a population genetic database. So they looked at it in a general population, and then they were able to identify how many of the population had a change in the gene that causes PKD. And so the conclusion was that about 1 in 1,000 people had the change in the gene which causes PKD. So that was good evidence to help.
So that equates currently to perhaps about 25,000 approximately in Australia. That's sort of the numbers we've used.
That's right. But what I would preface that by saying is that there is probably at least more than 50% or even 60% of those people who may have a mild form of PKD. And in days gone by, when I guess medicine, we weren't doing scans on people, those people might travel through their life without any problems. So they may not, some would get hypertension, some might have a little bit of impaired renal function. So that's also something to consider, that there's a bit of variability in the severity in who develops kidney failure in their life.
Yeah, good point. So there's an interesting one here from Rachel. Are there any clinical trials that are or have investigated the role and treatment implications of estrogen in potentially increasing the size of liver cysts in AD-PKD women, particularly during perimenopause and menopause?
So again, there are what we call the population studies or the cohort studies. So, for example, in the Netherlands, there is a clinic where they went back and had a look at whether estrogen exposure might be associated with liver cyst growth. So they looked back 10 years back. So it's what we call a retrospective study. And so in that study, they found that there was an association that estrogen exposure was associated with increasing liver cyst growth. There's a lot of difficulties in making conclusions from those type of studies, because you can never be, it might sound strange, but you can never be sure of the cause and effect, because when you're analysing some data sets, there could be many other factors that are involved as well. But estrogen, in general, in the perimenopausal setting, the exposure is short-term, and or it can be short-term, and it's not something that's going to accelerate growth. A lot of the growth, if it's going to happen, is really happens before menopause. And so it's, again, a risk-benefit analysis, and it's really something that individually someone would have to be counselled on. It's not firm evidence, but it'd be something to consider in a discussion with your doctor. There's no evidence that oral contraceptive pills, so for birth control, the levels of estrogen in those agents is extremely much lower. and it's not been associated with accelerating liver cyst growth.
Okay.
This has actually been discussed in great detail in a meeting I went to. So I'm part of a clinical practice guideline group that's led by an international consortium called KDIGO, and they're about to release these guidelines. So there was a lengthy discussion at our meeting about that, and hopefully the guidelines will be up for public review and in the next month or so.
Yeah, well, that's great, and we'll make sure we share anything that we can relating to that when the time comes. Okay, I'm mindful of the time, but one other, I mean, you've sort of answered this one, but I'm sure there's more you could say on this. Alyssa's asked, what are the main limitations to trials in Australia? Is it government funding? Is it recruiting? Is it specialist involvement? What are your thoughts on that? And both of you, by all means.
Oh, Vanessa, I've done a lot of talking.
Look, I mean, I'm a consumer advocate with a few different kidney groups related to PKD, and so I can only go off sort of what I've heard, but certainly funding is huge. There's so much more research that researchers and clinicians want to do, and that we as a community want them to do, than is actually funded. So I guess where the community comes in then is being advocates. So being, outspoken about PKD, talking about it, whether you're, speaking to your local member or just raising awareness of it. Another thing is that with the funding is that just generally with research, I think, again, we always think that, the government should look after that or whatever. But whether it's trials or other forms of research, one thing that you can do is you could actually fundraise as well, because PKD Australia, for example, gives grants for research projects. And so if you wanted to fundraise for research, then that's actually something that you could do yourself. So, there's small things that you can do on the ground within your family and your community to be part of that. I mean, obviously it's not going to fund some, huge trial, but you could at least contribute. And that could be a good option too for people that maybe don't feel like they want to be part of a trial themselves, or maybe they live too far away or they can't access it. So you could still play a part in that research, either through advocacy or through fundraising. Apart from that, I think, it's really being able to recruit patients as well. Recruiting people into the trial seems to be an issue. And that's probably the word of mouth is just not getting out there. And I think collectively we're looking at, well, why is that? Are the GPs and the nephrologists not passing this information on? And are they the best place to be disseminating that information? But then I think it comes back to a bit of responsibility on the community as well, to us as patients and carers, that we really need to talk about it. We need to get the word out that these opportunities are available, because unfortunately, the GPs and nephrologists are flat out. There's only so much they can do. And so I think we need to be proactive in trying to help ourselves as much as possible, finding out, being active in our inquiry. Yeah.
Might be worth a quick mention about AKTN, Gopi, on that note.
That's right. The AKTN stands for Australasian Kidney Trials Network, and they're based in the Princess Alexandra Hospital in Brisbane. And essentially, they're the platform for major trials going on in Australia, particularly those that are, primarily those that are government funded. So if you go to their website, there'll be a whole range of studies, and that's also another source of information. I also want to just second Vanessa's comment on fundraising, because a good example is the PKD Australia grants have funded or provided our PREVENT trial to get off the ground. The IMPEDE trial, it was contributed to that, which then led to further funding. The big PKD trial, which is recruited 60 people, was done entirely with PKD Australia's budget, and it's with that grant funding, I mean. And so that's a small trial, but it could provide some, useful evidence for the future.
Yes, and it's something that we want to do, is actually feedback some of the progress of previous research grants and the outcomes, because of course we understand that, you know, that helps people feel a part of the process when they're participating and raising funds, and then are able to actually see what a difference that makes.
Mm.
So yeah, we'll do that for sure. Um, okay, well look, we're sort of out of time, so I'm going to just quickly point out a couple of things that really stuck out for me on the way out. The first one is, and it comes up so often with PKD, and that is that there's a lot of hope. And when we get to hear from someone like you, Gopi, and Vanessa's personal experience, it really, lifts our spirits and makes us feel that there certainly is hope, and there's a lot of exciting things happening. And we will, as an organisation, make sure we do our best to communicate those things to you. The other thing I think Vanessa raised is the living guidelines. That's probably a really important resource for people to have a look at, and so I'll get the link for that, and we'll be able to perhaps send that out. And the other thing I think is the pay it forward for PKD concept, because if you are making a difference, whether it is for you, given the genetic nature of PKD, whether it's for you or someone in your family. I hear a lot from people who say, there's not too much that can happen for me. I might be in my 50s or 60s, but if I can do anything to help my children, then that's what I want to do. So thank you both very much on behalf of everyone who's been here today, and the board and myself at PKD Australia. We've really appreciated your time and your knowledge and your care and consideration, both of you. So thank you kindly.